Has Catholicism been proven false? Dr. Dustin Crummett, an Anglican philosopher, says yes. Stick around to find out.
You're watching Reason and Theology Live, a show dedicated to charitable discussions, debates, interviews, commentary, and analysis. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
All right, welcome back to Reason and Theology. Your host, Michael. Has Catholicism been proven false? Well, I'm going to say no. Dr. Dustin Crummett, again, an Anglican philosopher, did a video. Let's see how long ago it was. Does it tell me? I guess it doesn't, but it was a few weeks ago on capturing Christianity. And I was on Cameron's show earlier today, where I did a refutation of 8 of his objections from that original video. The video was called How Catholicism Can Be Proven False. At least that's the one that I was responding to. The one in which I offered a partial response to is entitled No, Catholicism Hasn't Been Proven False, with Michael Lofton on Capturing Christianity. So, with time constrictions, I only addressed 8, I guess, of the more substantive objections. But what I wanted to do is engage the rest of the objections that I was able to perceive from his presentation. Now, please don't misunderstand me. These are more kind of the they're not as serious maybe as some of the other objections. Let me maybe rephrase that, because that could sound bad. I'm not saying that he wasn't as serious in presenting them. They're maybe less substantive and less cogent. So these are more of the, smaller arguments, I guess. I mean, I guess that could be misunderstood too. We all tend to present, when it comes to arguments against a particular position, some of our arguments are stronger than others. I dealt with his strongest arguments on capturing Christianity. These are some of the other ones that were kind of left over. I think they're still worth addressing, even though I know they're not the more substantive ones. So I say that because you might think, oh, Michael, you're just being petty and nitpicking some of these objections. And well, wait, not really. I selected the most substantive objections and already addressed those. So go and watch that video if you haven't seen them already. In these, again, I'm going to address more the kind of the side objections that aren't as central, I guess, to his presentation. I guess that's a way to put it. So don't misunderstand me and think, oh, you're just being petty here, nitpicking. No, I already addressed the more substantive ones, and here we'll kind of do the smaller ones. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation for this one. I did have a PowerPoint for the others, but I did not prepare one for this one. So just FYI. Let me see first. Let me look at the chat. Larry Romano says, I got $5 that says no. According to whom, though, right? I mean, some people would probably agree with Dr. Dustin that Catholicism was proven false. So it just depends on who you ask. But I do think that we can ascertain the truth and come to a knowledge of the truth objectively. So I do think we can evaluate these things. It's not entirely subjective. F2 says 3 shows in a day. Michael's going back to his old ways. Yeah, I've had an opportunity today to do some here. His holiday has recharged him. Is it that, or is it the cappuccino machine that I got earlier? Which one is it? I don't know. It might be the cappuccino or espresso, whatever the thing is called. The espresso machine that makes cappuccinos. I've never had one before, but y'all know I'm a professional coffee drinker, and I've never owned an espresso machine. So I bought an espresso machine because it was on sale. And I watched a YouTube video on how to use it. I don't know if I've ever had an espresso before, but I had one earlier today, and I'm telling you, the energy was through the roof. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. So I'm a little concerned, but it was like on another level. So yeah, I could feel my heart, palpitating. So maybe that's why I got a little more energy today than usual. But the energy is only manifesting itself from the body up, from the chest up, because pretty much my legs on down are no good. Because I stubbed my toe the other night, my toenail on the door, so severely that it completely dislodged the toenail, or almost completely dislodged the toenail. This is probably too much information here, but we're getting way off course here. But yeah, I'm having a little bit of a struggle walking around. So all the energy is from here on up, but it's not, anyways, TMI, right? Jade says, congrats, Michael. That presentation of yours was good, especially the advice you gave to Cameron. I appreciate it. Thank you. Emily says, peace. I slapped the like button on the way. Nice. Thank you. Perhaps Michael can do a video on has Anglicanism been proven false? Oh, that would be interesting. All right, let's get to it. But hold on, wait. It's time for the vintage Michael to return to the shaved head and trim beard. I don't know. I kind of have mixed feelings about that. Should I? I've kind of been thinking about it. I don't know. By the way, I know I'm looking sideways. I got some really good advice from Cameron on how I can get a teleprompter so that I can see everybody and at the same time look in the camera. So that's soon to come. I went ahead and got the equipment, so it'll be coming soon. Zach Rome says, praying for that toenail. Pray that it would fully be removed, because right now I'm in this odd position where my toe looks like a zombie, but the toenail's still there, but I can't fully deal with it unless I just completely removed it. And yeah, I know, again, that's TMI, right? The show has taken a turn, right? God bless you, Michael. Don't have much capacity to support, but love what you do. Thank you, Giovanni, for the super chat, and I appreciate it. Look, if you don't have means to support financially, that's fine too. Please pray, as I always say, that I'll be charitable, that my words will give grace to those who hear, and that I won't be a scandal and stumbling block to Christ and to others, right? So I appreciate the support, though. Thank you. All right, so let me share my screen. Let's do that. I'm going to share my screen, and let's maybe go through a few timestamps. I'm going to go to the 8:05, so 8-minute, 5-second mark, and let's maybe just start there and see how this goes. Please let me know, by the way, if y'all are not able to hear the audio whenever I begin playing it, because I don't want to do a whole show again where nobody can hear the presentation except me. So, all right, let's proceed.
But again, what he was saying was not about the history of the papacy was not controversial, even among a lot of Catholic historians, people like Eamon Duffy or Raymond Brown, who was a Catholic priest and maybe the most prominent Catholic historian of the 20th century.
This might sound petty, but I promise you it's actually not petty. But I'm gonna have to point out, I've never seen Raymond Brown identified as a historian. Now, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know everything. Maybe it's out there. Now, I have seen him write a book that deals with some apostolic history issues. But his expertise and how he's actually identified as a biblical scholar, I think to call him an historian, I think is already, again, this might sound petty at first, but hear me out. To call him a historian, I think is to misidentify his area of expertise. And to call him one of the most prominent of the 20th century, I think we're really missing the mark at this point. Because, again, I could see somebody saying that about him being a biblical scholar, one of the most prominent of the 20th century in biblical studies, but not history. But in the context of what he's saying here, he's talking about the papacy and the history of the papacy. and he's appealing to Eamon Duffy and then Father Brown. And he really kind of hangs his hat on Father Brown here as a historian. And I want to say, but wait, he wasn't a historian. That's not his area of expertise. Perhaps he, to my knowledge, he did do a book dealing with some issues of the apostolic churches, if I recall correctly. But again, that's outside of his area of expertise. So why is that important? Why is that me not nitpicking and being petty? It's important because if you're going to appeal to a secondary source by an author where that's their area of expertise. It reminds me of those atheists who appeal to Bart Ehrman on the most remote things that have nothing to do with textual criticism. And I'm just thinking, but wait, his area of expertise is textual criticism. It's not the afterlife. That, the theology of the afterlife or something like that. Maybe there's some competency there, but I wouldn't appeal to him as an expert by any means. So I think sometimes we end up confusing people who are experts in one area, and then we transfer that over to another area. And that's a problem, because if we're citing them as an expert in that area to back up something that we're saying, that's not proper. So again, I'm not trying to be petty here. I think that this is actually incredibly important because I'm seeing it happening over and over and over. And in fact, I heard him appeal to several individuals in this video on matters of the papacy and history, and that's not their area of expertise. I wouldn't even say that's their area of competency. I'm not trying to be mean. I'm just saying that that's not their area. They do have areas. They do have areas of expertise. It's just that's not what it is. And so that doesn't mean that we ignore what they say. I mean, a person can still make a good point, even if they're outside of their area of expertise or even competency. A person can still present a good argument, but I'm not going to appeal to them as an authority. And that's what's being done here, is we have an appeal to authority in multiple occasions to somebody who's actually not an authority in that area. So all that we really can do is maybe appeal directly to their argument, and then I can address their argument. Unfortunately, he doesn't give me an argument from Raymond Brown. So Raymond Brown could actually make a good point about the papacy and its historicity. He could do that, but I didn't hear any points made. And I don't recognize Raymond Brown as an authority on the history of the papacy. I don't recognize that. So an appeal to an authority here, I think, is not going to cut it. So again, I'm not trying to be petty, but I am just trying to say, I think that that's important, and we should know it. Okay. Am I going back to Catholic Answers? I didn't know I left. Did I leave? No, I'm still working with Catholic Answers. In fact, I need to send them an article. I've been in Costa Rica for a few weeks here, so I haven't been able to do a whole lot of anything. Just now getting back into the swing of things, and I'm gonna send them an article. And yeah, I'm still with Catholic Answers. I wholeheartedly support Catholic Answers and what they're doing. I am a product of their ministry in a very real sense. As I said, they helped me in a lot of ways in my own conversion to Catholicism. So I believe strongly in what Catholic Answers is doing, because again, I've been one of those people who have benefited from it. So yeah, I didn't know it left. Did I give the impression that I left at some point? But good reminder. I'll probably send them, an article tonight, so you can expect something soon. Okay, so an appeal to a historian who's not actually an historian, that doesn't seem very convincing to me. Let's go to the 9-minute mark. Start right before that, actually. Start maybe around 8:54. Let's see if that's good enough.
Some of the church. And again, as far as I know, really the consensus of historians is that this is not true. The papacy as an office, and then the powers that were attached to the papacy, developed over time, long after the apostles were all dead.
So first of all, I would question whether or not one is in the position to evaluate the consensus of historians when we identify Father Raymond Brown as one of the most prominent historians of the 20th century. I would sincerely question whether or not we can make that evaluation. Moreover, I've noticed a constant appeal to secondary sources, vague references, by the way, to secondary sources. I'm not hearing specifics in the vast majority of these instances. He's mentioning secondary sources, the consensus of scholars, the consensus of historians, but you might get a name or two here and there, but no real references and full citations. And look, I know this is YouTube, so I mean, we're not using Chicago style or something in our citation of sources. But what I'm saying is, when you make a really serious claim and an appeal to secondary source, it's usually appropriate even on YouTube to give a good idea of where this came from, at least the book that it came from, if not a page number. Especially given how serious some of these claims are. But again, I'm noticing not only a lot of vague references to secondary sources, but just secondary sources, period. Please don't misunderstand me. Secondary sources are important. I know some people who only engage in primary sources, and that is to their detriment, because you're trying to reinvent the wheel at this point. And believe me, you're not as smart as some of those guys out there who are scholars in this area. You need to be reading the secondary source literature as well. So none of us are smart enough to really go and reinvent the wheel like that. So none of us are in a position to go and read primary sources and nothing but primary sources. I think we need to have a balance of both. We need to be reading primary sources and secondary sources. We need both, because if you have an over-reliance on secondary sources and then even just select secondary sources, you're often going to have a distorted perception of things. I remember I heard Father Kappas, mega scholar, saying, look, I took this idea from scholarship on St. Augustine, this particular thing that they're always saying about Augustine. I took it for granted. But until I came across this in his corpus, and then I came across it again and again and again in Augustine's corpus. And that just goes to show you how far some of the secondary source literature is from the actual primary sources. That's true. Some of these scholars do have some deficiencies. So we do need to balance it out. We do need our primary sources. We need to have familiarity with the actual texts, the actual fathers. But then we do also need to read some secondary source literature who also talk about those fathers, because there's a whole lot that we can glean from them. But we don't need to have an over-reliance on either one. But what I'm hearing is an unfamiliarity throughout this presentation with the primary sources. And I would even say an unfamiliarity with a lot of the secondary source literature, because I already presented in the other video a lot of secondary sources that undermine what the sweeping claims that he's making in the secondary source literature on the history of the papacy. I already showed that. So I would already challenge his assertions about the secondary source literature. But even so, I'm not entirely impressed by somebody who can just quote secondary sources. I'm more impressed by somebody who can actually read the primary sources and is familiar with them. And I noticed people were asking him questions specifically about the primary sources in the Q&A towards the end. He wasn't familiar with them. And I'm not saying like you have to know every primary source out there and you have to have read every church father. That's unreasonable. Nobody can ever do that. But what I'm saying is you should be familiar with the basics when it comes to the primary sources, rather than having an over-reliance on a select group of secondary sources and secondary source literature. So that's some of my concerns here. I know that may at first sound petty, but it's important, because if you have an over-reliance on secondary sources and you're not familiar with the primary sources, I think you can sometimes have a distorted understanding. And that's certainly the case with the papacy, because I'm telling you, you can look at some of the secondary sources and they're not talking about the Formula of Hermistus. They're not talking about Philip the Legate. They're not talking about Agatho at the 6th Council. They're not talking about Hadrian at the 7th Council. They're not talking about these things in some cases. And some of these scholars will make sweeping claims about the papacy in the first millennium. And I'm just thinking, so you've never read the Formula of Hermistus, not even a vague reference to the Formula of Hermistus, like nothing. I've seen it. It's glaring in the scholarship of orthodoxy. It's glaring there. You'll see Meyendorff, like huge blind spots. And Meyendorff is an incredibly intellectual man, and I'm just thinking, it's not the case that he's just, you know, not intelligent. This guy is brilliant, but he doesn't seem to be, in all instances, considering some important factors, or at least he's giving that impression because he doesn't even mention it when it's appropriate to be mentioned. Because you can't expect a scholar to mention everything in a work of literature, or in one of these historical bodies, but you should be able to expect it when it's appropriate to be mentioned. And I've noticed that with figures like Meyendorff and others. And it's not just Orthodox. I see this with a lot of Catholic historians on the papacy as well. All right, so I hope that doesn't sound like nitpicking. I hope that makes a little bit more sense of where I'm coming from here. But let me rewind that once again and play it one more, because there was a comment there about development that I wanted to charitably challenge.
Office, and then the powers that were attached to the papacy developed over time, long after the apostles were all dead.
All right, so he's talking about there's a distinction between the papacy and the powers that developed over time. Well, there's a sense in which I would actually agree with Dr. Crummett here. I would say that the substance of the papal claims is there in the New Testament. So I'm going to say it's there, but I'm going to say it's there in seed form. And that it does begin to develop actually very, very early on. It begins to develop, and we see it practiced more and more and more. So I'm going to concede some development here in the way that the papacy conducts itself. There's certainly an element of development throughout history. But I want to say that this isn't a development that is from nowhere. I want to say that the seeds are there in the apostolic literature, namely the New Testament. So it's there, but it's there in seed form, and yes, it begins to become unpacked throughout the centuries. But very, very early on, beginning with the 2nd century, you start to see, the papal claims blossoming more and more, and you see them become even more prominent with the issue with Cyprian and Pope Stephen, and then it's really growing by the time you have Damasus, and really, really growing by the time you have Leo. And so it's there in C form at the beginning, but I am going to concede some development. But I don't think that that's a problem. I think that there's nothing wrong with that, because I'm going to say the same thing about the Trinity. I want to say that the substance of the doctrine of the Trinity is there in the New Testament. I do believe that, but I think, St. Gregory was right to point out that, it really wasn't until the 4th century that we really started to talk about the Holy Spirit being consubstantial with the Father. Why is that? Does that mean that's a post-apostolic dogma? No. I'm not going to agree with the Muslims who actually want to make that argument. I'm going to say no. It's there in the New Testament, but it certainly is in seed form in the New Testament. And it does take time for us to really ruminate on that issue and develop it and start to speak of the Holy Spirit as consubstantial with the Father, in the way that we speak of the Son being consubstantial with the Father. So there's development there, even in the doctrine of the Trinity, but it's rooted in substantially and essentially in the New Testament. So it's not a post-apostolic dogma. So I'm going to say the same thing about the papacy. So I'm kind of agreeing with Dr. Crummett here, but then kind of not. To me, an issue of development to the papacy is not a deal breaker, because I'm going to say everybody has to acknowledge development to dogma. Everybody. Protestant, Orthodox, Catholic. I know some Orthodox don't like talking about development, but that's absurd. You can't be orthodox and not acknowledge a form of development of doctrine when you venerate icons? I mean, let's be serious here. You're kissing icons. And I'm an Eastern Catholic too, so I'll be right there with you. But I'm just saying, like, you're kissing icons. All right, just think about that for a second now. Was Paul kissing icons? No. Did Paul teach the substance that would lead to that? I would say yes, actually. I would say the incarnation is what leads to that, and he's certainly preaching the incarnation. But was Paul kissing icons? No. If he was, why weren't the Jews accusing Christians of idolatry? They would have saw that, they would have jumped on us for that, but they didn't do that. Why is that? Because Christians weren't kissing icons in the first century. Is that somehow an indictment against the Seventh Ecumenical Council? No, because I want to say the substance of the claims for icon veneration is apostolic, but it's there in seed form. But it does take time for it to develop. So again, you can't be an Orthodox without recognizing development in some kind of form. So Catholics, Orthodox, Protestants, we all recognize development when it comes to dogma. So for me, just an appeal to a development when it comes to the papacy doesn't really carry a whole lot of weight. Let's go to around 934. Let's see. Let me just start right here.
And that is just not true. And you can see that by looking at writings of church fathers and seeing that the Eastern churches never acknowledged the papacy.
So I already addressed that one in the previous show, so I'm just going to gloss over that part.
The supremacy of the Pope, by looking at the way that ecumenical councils were conducted, all sorts of things. I think
now notice he mentioned there the church fathers. So what I dealt with in the other video was a focus on the ecumenical councils on the papal claims, and also the secondary source literature. Since he had an appeal to secondary sources, so I went straight to the secondary sources to undermine his appeal. But he also mentioned there the church fathers. I don't know. I think that there's a really strong argument in the patristic literature for the papal claims, and I'm willing to defend that. For those who would say otherwise. I do think that there are things in the fathers that also undermine, some of the fathers that undermine the papal claims. So I don't think that all of the fathers agreed to the exact same thing. I think that you do have some fathers who said some things that would undermine all kinds of views, but that doesn't mean that I'm now conceding that the church fathers collectively or somehow are against the papal claims or something. No, I think an appeal to the patristic literature works in favor of the Catholic claims on the papacy. Now, I'm not going to reinvent the wheel here. Just go to my papacy playlist. Plenty of primary sources that I've engaged there with the church fathers. Maybe start with that video that I did on 4 patristic sources that deal with the papal claims, or I forget the name of it. Let me go and look it up. Hold on. I probably just butchered it. Let's see. Playlist. Let me go to papacy. I've done over 1,000 videos at this point in 3.5 years. So it's like you tend to, after a while, you start forgetting some of the titles. Unless you're Jimmy Akin. Now, Jimmy Akin remembers every episode that he's ever done on Akin's Mysterious World, and he can tell you the number of the number show that it is. You need to go to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World number 171 that answers that. And I'm just thinking, what? You remember the number of the show? I wish I had that memory. That is crazy. Let me see if I can find it real quick. It's in the papacy playlist. Here's one with Philip, Leo, and Agatha, 3 witnesses. There's another one where I did like Athanasius and a few others. Trying to specifically find that one. Don't know how to. Oh, here it is. Julius, Athanasius, Sozomen, and Leo. Those are some ones you don't tend to hear a whole lot about, so that's kind of why I selected those. You don't hear a whole lot about Pope Julius or Athanasius as a source for the papacy, or Sozomen. How often do you hear that? Now I do have Leo thrown in there, but still, you'll see why if you go watch the video. I think that's a good place to start. I have another one on Pope Leo, Philip, the legate at Ephesus, and others, and Canon 6 of Nicaea, and I also did one on Swansona's channel where I go over Agatha at the 6th Ecumenical Council, and I think Eric tackles Hadrian at the 7th, and Elijah tackled Leo at the 4th. So, like I said, just go to the papacy playlist. You'll see plenty of stuff there. I'm not going to reinvent the wheel now. All right, let's go to another timestamp here. Let's see. Let's maybe go to the 10-minute mark right around here. Let's just start at 10 even.
Where church offices are discussed extensively, there's no indication to my mind that there is a pope or that Peter is the pope. In Galatians, Paul seems to me, and again to most biblical scholars, to be very clearly putting himself on the same level as Peter and the other.
Again, no reference to specific biblical scholars, but he puts himself on the same level in some sense as St. Peter. Well, there's actually a real sense in which Paul was on the same level as Peter. So it's kind of like that's not going to work against the Catholic claims, because I actually would somewhat concede that. An apostle is first of all over a pope. That's why I made a distinction between an apostle and a pope earlier, and how it's sometimes inappropriate to speak of Peter as pope, although we can, but we have to very clearly define what we mean by Peter as pope, because an apostle is greater than a pope. So I feel like we're demoting Peter whenever we speak of him as a pope in most cases, but I digress. Paul is relatively equal to Peter. They're both apostles. The only real difference, there would actually be 2 real differences, is there's going to be priority of Peter among the apostles, and I already demonstrated that in the previous video. Go check it out. But there clearly is a priority of leadership, and also there's a priority in his office as leader among the apostles that perpetuates in a successor to St. Peter, that does not perpetuate in a successor to St. Paul, for example. Even though Paul in his martyrdom in Rome played a very strong role in the elevation of the Church of Rome, I have no problem with that. That's not the ultimate basis for the claims of the Roman Church, however. See Pope Damasus again, among many others. So what I want to say here is, again, there's a real sense in which Paul is equal to Peter in almost everything. The only difference is there is going to be a role of leadership of Peter among the rest of the apostles. And when it comes to successors of the apostles, that's where we're really going to start getting into some distinctions. As the successor of Paul, if you will, which, we don't generally speak in those kinds of terms. But the successors of Paul, if you will, I don't know what specific see I would identify with Paul anyway, other than Rome. The successor of Paul is not going to necessarily be on par with the successor of Peter. because of the once again the priority and the singling out of Peter among the rest of the apostles, and the fact that that ministry is going to perpetuate in successors. So you're not going to see a whole lot of huge difference in the New Testament between Peter and the rest of the apostles, because they're all really, 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 really high when it comes to authority. These are all individuals individually commissioned by Christ. Every one of these apostles are individually commissioned by the risen Lord. So their authority is way on up here. A pope is like way down here compared to that, right? But let's continue here.
They're apostles. He disagrees with Peter and is not at all worried about disagreeing with the Pope. He mentions.
See, that's where I'm going to say, you know what? I'm not sure that's a really strong argument. Later on in the video during the Q&A, to my recollection, somebody once again asks him about it, and he kind of walked that argument back. But he hangs his hat on this issue in this portion of Galatians. But then he again kind of walks it back. I don't know if he starts to think about it further, but he starts to say that, well, I guess it could be that, you don't have to accept everything a pope says. So maybe that's what's going on with Paul and Peter. Okay. Well, two things. It's curious. Number one, that Aquinas actually quotes this as an example where an inferior can rebuke a superior. And I think that's a legitimate proof text. So there are instances, obviously, in which we don't have to assent to what the Pope is saying. That's most certainly clear. That's not disputed in Catholicism. And then there are also scenarios where the Pope could even be corrected by an inferior. We recognize that. It's curious that the canonical tradition says, y'all remember? What does the canonical tradition say? The first see is judged by no one, except, what's the exceptional clause that you tend to find in the canonical tradition? Except, y'all able to finish the sentence? Anybody in the chat? Can y'all finish the sentence for me? I want to see who's paying attention, because I'm not seeing the chat moving right now. So is anybody paying attention? Finish the sentence for me in the canonical tradition, or at least part of the canonical tradition. The first see is judged by no one, except, well, ain't nobody typing there in the chat, so I guess I'll finish it for y'all. Except in the case of heresy. Except in cases of heresy. I don't believe the Pope can teach heresy in his magisterium, but as a private individual, he could maintain a heresy and even utter that in a non-magisterial way, like in an interview or something like that. So in that case, you could actually have an inferior correct the Pope. Now there's Father Brown, except heresy. There you go. It takes a little time for it to kind of update on my end. You probably said it. Amber said, had no clue. Yeah, I mean, again, some will leave that clause out in the canonical tradition, and then some will actually have that clause in there. But what's curious is that clause finds approbation at the Eighth Ecumenical Council. What was it? Canon 21? The end of Canon 21? Something like that. And then in further comments deriving from the Eighth Ecumenical Council, 869 to 870. So this idea of correcting the Pope in cases of heresy is certainly a Catholic one, and we don't have to shy away from that. So if we can recognize that in not only our canonical but also conciliar tradition, it's not a strong argument in my estimation, because we kind of already conceded it. Paul rebuked Peter. So what? We can do that to a Pope. So I don't know. I don't think it's a really strong argument. Let's see. Let's go to the 10-minute, 40-second mark. So let's just continue from here.
The so-called pillars of the church, James, Peter, and John, but there's no indication that Peter has any special status. he very clearly, is saying, I was not appointed by Peter or by anybody else. I was appointed by Jesus.
That's not an argument against the papacy or the fact that Peter has priority or leadership among the apostles. That's not an argument. Nobody is ever claiming that Peter had to appoint everyone. Nobody claims that the Pope has to appoint everyone. In the historical tradition, it's generally not the Pope determining, for example, who's going to be a bishop. Who was it? I mean, very early on, it was generally the laity. Now, it wasn't the laity ordaining him. They would have 3 other bishops from surrounding territory ordained, but it was generally the laity that would choose them. And then throughout history, it tended to be synods, and bishops in that territory who would decide who the next bishop would be. I mean, obviously, there's different forms here. So it doesn't have to be that the Pope somehow decides who a bishop is going to be, any more than it would have to be that Peter decides who an apostle is going to be. Now, Peter did kind of head the casting of lots in the book of Acts to determine a successor of Judas, but you'll notice he did not determine the successor of Judas. It was God who determined it. He just kind of, led the process. So I don't know who's making this claim that somehow Paul being commissioned by Christ personally undermines the leadership of Peter. Whoever said that was required? I don't know anybody who's ever argued that. So I'm not exactly sure where this argument is coming from. Maybe it's coming from the fact that in today's cases, the Pope is appointing bishops for most of the churches, not all the sui juris churches, but in many of the cases, he's appointing every bishop. And it's kind of like, okay, yeah, I think we need to dial this back. I understand historically how we got here, but I think it's time that we pass that one back over to, synods of bishops and let them determine their own bishops and at the most just have the Bishop of Rome. He has a right to dispute it, kind of like the emperor used to. Just leave it at that. So maybe that's where it's coming from. I don't know, but that's not native to the papacy. It's not essential to the papacy. That's more of a post-apostolic practice that has developed most recently, actually, that we don't think is essential to the papacy. So I'm not sure where this argument is coming from, but maybe I've misunderstood the argument. Okay, let's see. Okay. Let's go to the 13-minute mark and look at some of the Marian doctrines.
Things, for instance, things having to do with Mary, the perpetual virginity of Mary, the assumption of Mary bodily into heaven. And you can contrast the situation here with, say, the resurrection. We know that belief in the resurrection began almost immediately, right? If belief in the resurrection had begun 150 years later, that would be very suspicious. You'd wonder, did the early Christians not know about it? Did they not think it was important?
So let me maybe just stop it there and offer some pushback here. Here, I want to say that I fear that Dr. Crummett may not be aware of the concept of the hierarchy of truths, because we're going to say there is certainly priority to those doctrines that are central to the gospel, as opposed to those doctrines that are peripheral and not central to the gospel. The Marian doctrines are way on the outskirts. they're right there with indulgences. They're way out there. What's central to the gospel are doctrines like the incarnation, the resurrection, the divinity of Christ, the humanity of Christ, the Trinity. These are the ascension. These are things that are central to the gospel proclamation. So they're going to be given priority in the historical record. That's why you have, what are they focusing on in the first 7 ecumenical councils? Christology. Somebody might say, well, the 7th council is not about Christology, it's about icons. Wrong. The issue of icons is a Christological issue. Because it effectively and indirectly is saying that Christ did not fully become human, because if he did fully become human, that's going to have some implications on the material realm and how we interact with the Son of God. So, so even the Seventh Ecumenical Council is actually Christological in nature. Even the Marian doctrines are all ultimately about Christ, and they impact Christology. The Immaculate Conception is more saying something about Jesus than it is Mary. Mary being the Theotokos is more saying something about Jesus than it is Mary. And it's certainly more safeguarding something about Jesus than it is Mary. The Assumption, likewise. So, but again, they're way further in the hierarchy of truth. So I don't expect that to kind of be the center stage. Now, what you're going to have is some Protestants say, okay, well, I understand that it's not going to be center stage in the hierarchy of truths, and so it's not going to be emphasized as much, and it's not going to be given priority. I understand that, but in discussions where Mary comes up, they're not always aware, perhaps, of the fate of the Virgin Mary. Now, look, go and watch the video that Trent Horn did responding to Gavin Ortlund. I think he did a good job in responding, so I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. Go and watch that. But I will say that I totally understand that objection. But what I will say is, it is not the case that every father or witness in the patristic era has to be aware of the what's the word I'm looking for? I guess the dogma, or the fact that this is something that comes from the apostolic era. Not everybody has to be aware of that. So when it comes to the transmission of the gospel proclamation, along with the things that are peripheral to it and other issues that were taught by the apostles and are from the apostolic era, the transmission of that is not going to be evident in every single individual. It will be there as a whole in the church as a whole, but it won't be there necessarily in every individual. But you do have very early on, you start to have attestation to things like the Assumption, and at least the Immaculate Conception in seed form. And that's why you start to have liturgical feasts associated with these things. From whence did they derive? They already derived from popular belief in these things. Now, again, maybe go and watch the video with Trent Horn, because he's going to deal with some pushback that could be offered there. But that's going to be my response here, is that I kind of expect some of these things that are lower in the hierarchy of truths to be discussed much later, like indulgences. I don't expect indulgences to be discussed in the 3rd century or something like that. But the concept behind indulgences is certainly going to be apostolic. Icon veneration, I don't expect that to really be discussed very early in Catholicism and in church history, but I do expect the substance of the iconophile claims to be there, present in the patristic era, even in the apostolic era, if we're going to claim it's dogmatic, which we do claim it's dogmatic. So let's see. I will say something like this, though. Think about this. When is the earliest reference that you see to the idea that Jesus has two non-conflicting wills? Maybe let's call them non-nomic wills. I know somebody might offer some pushback there, but I think you know what I'm saying when I would say a nomic will, this idea of deliberation. He obviously didn't have to vacillate between decisions in his will. He sees the beatific vision, and so it's not like he's ever conflicted in his will of choosing to do right or versus wrong. Did he have the ability, if we're going to speak of a nomic will in that way? I could see how you would say that, but he certainly never would have acted on it, because he's so beholden to the beatific vision that he would never be even tempted to sin or choose evil. And so in that sense, I would say he doesn't have a nomic will. And so again, it just kind of depends on what we mean by it. But this, you could tell we're really dealing with some really high level theology here when we start talking about the wills of Christ and how they are there two wills and how do they interact with one another. And I mean, you really start to get into some serious business there, and they're incredibly important. They do impact our soteriology and the rest of our theology. So if you get it wrong there, it's going to lead to other problems. So it's certainly vital that we get it right. But who in the 2nd century is talking about this? who is talking about this in the 3rd century? I mean, I can't think of anybody offhand, to be honest. Does that mean this is post-apostolic in nature? Not necessarily. I think the substance of this is biblical, but the teasing out of these things, the implications of them, I think is something that does develop in time. Hold on, let me go tell Boxer to be quiet. 1 second. I don't know who Boxer was out there terrorizing, but he was going at it. I can think of many other areas that we're going to say are non-negotiables in Christology that aren't being discussed in the 2nd century. And that is not in favor of Muslims who are going to try to say that, well, this stuff wasn't there in the time of Jesus. No. It was. It's just, again, there in seed form. And so I expect the same thing with the Marian doctrines. Okay. Let's go to 1341. We're almost there already, so let's just continue playing. Share my screen, enable audio, and let's resume.
And that's really sort of what we find with these Marian dogmas. The New Testament evidence, to my mind, suggests that they think that Jesus has biological brothers, which would suggest that she was not a perpetual virgin. And it talks about Jesus's brothers, and it never mentions that they're not his biological brothers. It talks about Mary's virginity.
But you saw that? He actually assumed it rather than proving it. What does one mean? It talks about them as if they're biological brothers. Where? We're not dealing with the original language here. We're now talking about English, an English translation. I'm going to say that's insufficient. Let's go and actually deal with Greek and the terms that are used. And do any of those necessitate this idea that these are blood brothers? Quite the contrary. So I don't know where this is coming from. This is assumed rather than demonstrated, which it tends to be a problem that I've noticed over and over in the presentation, is he assumes his position rather than demonstrating it. I feel like sometimes he bit off more than he can chew. He goes over about 27 distinct objections to Catholicism in 20 minutes. I feel like it would have been better to just focus on 3 objections and that's it. And just hone in on those 3 objections in detail, and that's it. Rather than 27 that are just at a surface level and we can't really dive in deep into them. I would have rather him, let's go into the language of this word that you're saying is a brother. Let's actually go into the language and let's see, does it necessitate that position? And the answer is going to be no. I'm going to take a quick break here, y'all. Hang tight, give me a few minutes, and I will be back. By the way, I see the super chat there, Brad. When I come back, I'll answer it, and I will continue with the review. So, like I said, hang tight.
If you're looking to buy or sell a home, office, or any kind of property anywhere in the world, you're going to want to call Real Estate for Life, and they're going to connect you with a Catholic agent. Now, that agent will donate a portion of their commission upon sale, and Real Estate for Life will donate 75% of that gift to a pro-life organization at no cost to you. Call Real Estate for Life at 1-877-LIFE-US1 or text them 248-431-1440. If you care about the pro-life cause, call them now.
All right. Well, this isn't good. Somehow I managed to put these headphones, or one of the headphones, in my coffee. So there goes that earbud. I can still hear with this one, so we'll make it work. Let me grab this super chat real quick. Let's see here. Cardboard dog named Boxer. Yeah, he's definitely not made of cardboard, though, I can tell you. Brad, good night. Thank you for the super chat. Love your responses and how charitable you were. Thank you. Appreciate it. Honestly, I think the liturgical wars would have been a great practical criticism of Catholicism rather than doctrine, history, authority. Nice shout out to Eastern Catholicism. Thank you. Yeah. Well, look, as Catholics, we're going to know the areas of weakness better than a Protestant. So I think we can cut them slack. Especially considering this was way out of his wheelhouse. I looked at his CV, and this is not a criticism of Dr. Crummett. I'm just saying that it would be like me going on a show and doing a whole critique of political theory in Geneva or something like that. I don't know. I'd be way out of my depth. I think his areas of expertise were, let me pull it up. So it was applied ethics, area of specialty, applied ethics, social and political philosophy, and philosophy of religion. Area of competency, Islamic philosophy, philosophy of law. So when we're dealing with Catholicism like that, that's way outside of his area of expertise or competency. So I cut him some slack because I actually think that, he did pretty good when he's getting out of his wheelhouse. I mean, if I got out of my wheelhouse, I don't know if I'd do that good, to be honest. If I go and try to talk about his area is, again, applied ethics. Yeah, I'm out of my depth there. I'm not gonna go. But that's me though. I wouldn't do a show critiquing some form of applied ethics or something. I wouldn't do it. I would say no, I'm not a good fit there. I do have my area of specialty, and I have some areas of competency, but that's way out from me, so I wouldn't do it. But I would cut him some slack. Obviously, as Catholics, we're going to know areas of weakness better than anyone else because we're, at ground zero. So yeah, I mean, if I were going to critique Catholicism, I would have taken it in a very different direction. Okay. Let's see here. I just watched your Capturing Christianity video. Could you post your PowerPoint somewhere? I'd love to adapt it for some of our apologetics teachings in our community's seminarian formation program. Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think I can just post it on RNT website, reasonandtheology.com. So stay tuned for that. I should be able to do that. Okay, so let's go to another point here. I think it's at the 1352 mark. So let me just back it up where we are just a little bit to give us a little room. Xander, thank you for the super chat towards new earbuds. God bless. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah. All right. Let me share my screen once more. Enable audio. And let's resume.
They're not his biological brothers. It talks about Mary's virginity until she got married, and it doesn't mention that she remained a virgin afterward.
Yeah, so the until, right? The until argument. I haven't found this to be strong. He says it doesn't mention that, she remained a virgin afterwards, but he alludes to the until aspect of one of the verses. Of course, he's not specifically citing the verse, but we all know what he's referring to. So that Joseph didn't know her until I think that's hold on, let me not misquote it. Hold on. But we all know the passage. Let's go to it specifically though. All right. Matthew 1:25, but he did not consummate their marriage until she gave birth to a son, and he gave him the name Jesus. Okay, so you could see in the English language, you think, oh, wow, well, until, that just kind of means that up until that time, he didn't consummate the marriage, but he consummated the marriage afterwards. That makes sense in English. Unfortunately, the Bible was not written in English. Sorry, KJV onlyist people out there. I know you IFB guys love Steven Anderson. That might come as a disappointment, but it wasn't written in English. And obviously, Dr. Crummett knows that. And so my question is, why then not engage Koine Greek and address the actual underlying term that's used in the original language? Because once we do that, we realize that it doesn't necessarily carry that connotation. That's why you can find people like John Calvin himself saying that no just or well-grounded inference can be drawn from these words of the evangelist as to what took place after the birth of Christ. Why does Calvin say that? Well, because he recognizes it. The language in Greek doesn't necessitate the idea that the marriage was consummated, after the birth of Jesus. So I don't think that that's a really strong argument. I wish he had dealt more with, the specifics and the language. I think that would have been he would have been, able to present a stronger case. All right, let's maybe go to another point here. Okay. Let's go to the 1554 minute mark. So I'll go right before that. Let's go to 1530.
Many generations later, at a time when people are preaching celibacy, and you can imagine why people might make up this story. Sorry, my cat is attacking the carpet.
Well, I can relate with Boxer. I mean, Boxer's not a cat, but he's always attacking something. So I know how that goes.
The assumption doesn't arise until much later still. And, both of these at the time they arise, we have evidence they're not universally accepted. People disagree about these relevant doctrines.
Here's my concern: an appeal to disagreement. An appeal to disagreement does not disprove the apostolic or binding nature of a doctrine. If it did, nothing would be dogmatic. Nothing. The resurrection was disputed in the first century. The deity of Christ is already being disputed. Docetism is as early as orthodoxy. It's just like right there in the first century. Gnosticism is just as old as orthodoxy. Heresy is just as old as orthodoxy, effectively. You have all kinds of heresies. You have all kinds of lack of agreement. At Ephesus, what are they? Do they all just agree? Everybody's just all good. They're all on board with this concept of the Theotokos. Not exactly. Believe it or not, however, Nestorius does accept the Theotokos, and in the Orthodox sense, in his letters. But he did have some other issues. But you have debate on that, right? Other debates taking place here are whether or not you have a proper understanding of Christology, right? That's obviously being debated at Ephesus. The hypostatic union. How do the two natures work in relation to each other? There's a lack of agreement because at the time of Ephesus, you have actually two councils in the city of Ephesus. So you don't actually have one council of Ephesus. You actually have two meeting in Ephesus at the same time. You have Cyril's party, which is what we call the Council of Ephesus, but then simultaneously you also have John of Antioch's party that arrived like a week or two later after Cyril did, if I recall correctly. And he has his rival council. Now they later on make up with the formula of reunion in 433, but they're debating all kinds of things with each other, and they're calling each other heretics. You have all kinds of disputes there. There's plenty of disputes taking place at Chalcedon. There's plenty of disputes taking after Chalcedon because a lot of the Eastern churches don't want to accept Chalcedon because they think it's a deviation from Ephesus. So you start to have schisms in the church that have never been healed since then. This is where Oriental Orthodoxy partly comes from, because we start to have disagreements here. Now, some might say, well, it turned out that they weren't substantial, but that's irrelevant because they were still disputing them, right? So, but he's appealing to, well, there's people disputing the Marian doctrines, right? There's people disputing all kinds of issues of Christology. There's people disputing the canon. There's people disputing the Trinity, the resurrection, incarnation, and so on and so on and so on and so on. So a presence of this disputation or a lack of reception and universal reception means very little to me, because what was actually universally received? I mean, can we really speak of universal reception after Ephesus? I think we can speak of universal reception of Nicaea 1 in a very qualified way after the Arian crisis. Maybe 381, Constantinople 1. Maybe we can speak of kind of a universal reception there way after the fact. Rome certainly didn't receive it early on. So how can we speak really of a universal reception in any kind of meaningful way anyway? Now, I understand the way that some of the councils refer to this universal reception of something. I understand what they're saying, but that's not what Dr. Crummett is talking about when he speaks of lacks of dispute versus universal reception. Okay. Let's see. Let's go to 2243. There was a really interesting comment there on the magisterium, so I really perked up there. All right.
So when the Pope nowadays says things condemning slavery, really that's heavily qualified. He's not condemning slavery in principle, even though it looks like it may be, because that would be inconsistent with the old teachings.
I would certainly challenge that one. I mean, as early as the 1400s, you have popes vehemently opposing slavery. And now I know that they're going to try to make some appeals to certain papal documents, but I think they're often misunderstood. The popes are very, very strong on opposing an idea of slavery that was contrary to human dignity. So I don't find the slavery argument to be very strong. By the way, I want to thank you for the super chat there, Sean Matthew. Together we'll fund Michael's new headphones. Thank you, Dylan. Also headphone fund. I appreciate it. Well, let's see. We got $10, $2, and $5, and another $5. That is enough to cover it. I appreciate it, because I think it was $20. so let me make sure it's not working anymore. Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3. Well, they're back, so I guess I can give y'all a refund, right? It's back. It's working now, kids. That's okay, because the $20 y'all sent me, $25. Thank you so much for that. That will help go towards the about 400 that I just dropped on the teleprompter and stuff. So I appreciate it. Dylan said I paid the tax. I appreciate y'all. Thank y'all so much. I really do appreciate that. Let's see. Okay, yeah. Let me continue here with Dr. Crummett's presentation.
So it seems to me, first of all, that he's employing a hermeneutic that would never allow anything to count as a change, because you can always put in some reason that wasn't predictable in advance why these things are consistent. It also seems to me, if the point of the magisterium is to introduce clarity and all this sort of stuff, then first of all, the fact that some of the leading Catholic intellectuals in the US can't agree on things like, does the church teach that slavery is always wrong? And second of all, the fact that to get the result that the teachings don't change, you have to put in these qualifications that result in really nobody being able to tell what the teachings are at certain times, because later on we might find out that they were qualified in some way that was never indicated before. It seems to me that kind of undermines this supposed clarity that it introduces. So
no, but I understand where he's coming from, but I don't think this is a strong argument. So let me tackle the first part. So a lack of consensus among theologians on particular matters, does that undermine the whole purpose of the magisterium, which is to clarify issues? No. I've used this analogy before, right? Let's say you and I go hunting, right? I have a gun and you don't. And a bear is coming at both of us and it's going to kill us. You don't have a gun. that bear, you have no chance against that bear. You have no chance. I, however, have a chance, right? I have a chance. I go straight for a headshot. I wait till it gets right up to me, shoot it right in the face. And I have somewhat of a chance there, right? I know this is a little violent analogy here, but I got a chance. Now, let's say I say, you know what? I'm going to put this gun down. Or I'm just going to hold the gun. I'm not going to actually use it. Is there an objective difference between you and I? Yeah. Even if I don't use my gun, is there an objective difference between you and I? Yeah. I have the ability to take down the bear. I may choose not to, but I have the ability. You can't take that bear down whether you want to or not. You don't have the ability. It's the same thing with a magisterium. Without a magisterium, you don't have the ability to ask Mr. Bible to clarify itself for you. Mr. Bible, can you explain to me when you say this in Luke chapter 1, can you please explain to me, did I correctly interpret you? You can't ask Mr. Bible that, right? Now, you can ask the Holy Spirit for clarity, but we all know how that goes, because what if you think that you're getting clarity from the Holy Spirit and it's you or it's something else? So that's not really objective. I'm not saying we shouldn't ask the Holy Spirit, but what I'm saying is you can't really bank on that. So we can't do that with the Bible. We can't ask the Bible for further clarification. However, I can ask the magisterium for further clarification and get an objective answer. Obviously, this is analogies here going to assume whether or not the magisterium actually has the authority to do this, but there's a fundamental difference here. I can ask the magisterium for clarification. Now, what if the magisterium doesn't offer an intervention, right? So it doesn't offer clarification on an issue. It would kind of be like me choosing to delay whether or not I'm going to use that gun. Maybe I delay until he's 2 feet in front of me, the bear, rather than 10 feet. Maybe I should have shot him when he was 10 feet away, but I waited until he was 2 feet away. That's how I would liken it to the magisterium. Yeah, maybe sometimes it doesn't offer its intervention as quickly as we would like, but it is going to do it right before the bear gets there. At the end of the day, it will offer that intervention when it becomes necessary for souls. So the fact that you might have Catholics disputing something right now and the magisterium not offering a definitive intervention doesn't really mean a whole lot. Because the question is, does it have the authority to do so, and can it? That's really where the question is. So I don't think that that's a strong argument against the Catholic magisterium. Now, there was another component to that argument, so let's listen to it one more time.
Of course, there are more things that could be said about all of those things. There are also more things that could be said. I mean, I could talk about other topics too, but I think when we look at all of these things,
I like this comment. Just pray the bear away.
We find again and again that there are problems. The problems are not just in one domain. If it was, say, just an ethical problem, maybe I would think maybe I just have corrupt intuitions or something. But when it's a historical problem,
I think I skipped to the wrong part. Let me go back once more. Sorry.
That would never allow anything to count as a change, because you can always put in some reason that wasn't predictable in advance.
That was it right there. Let me play that again, because this is relevant to my dissertation. So here we go.
Slavery, really, that's heavily qualified. He's not condemning slavery in principle, even though it looks like it may be, because that would be inconsistent with the old teachings. So it seems to me, first of all, that he's employing a hermeneutic that would never allow anything to count as a change, because you can always put in some reason that wasn't predictable in advance.
See, I'm gonna, I have to vehemently disagree here, because I think that, let me be careful in the way I say this. I think that the claims of the Catholic Church are falsifiable. I don't think they're falsified. Notice the difference. I don't think the Catholic claims are falsified, but I think they're falsifiable. Like, you could demonstrate that they're false if they are false. That doesn't mean they are false, but I'm just saying that they're eligible to be demonstrated to be false. So I don't agree that, the magisterium and its claims are so aloof that you could just, it's a wax nose and you can turn it into whatever. No. Let me give you a perfect example that I think he would have to concede. Everyone watching is going to have to concede, whether you agree with the doctrine or not. We all agree the Catholic Church teaches the Immaculate Conception as dogma, right? You might not agree with the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. I'm not saying you agree with it. If you're a Protestant, you probably don't agree with it. But you, as a Protestant, recognize the Catholic Church teaches it as dogmatic, right? That's not in dispute, right? We all recognize that it teaches that dogmatically. That's not in dispute. Why is it not in dispute? Why? Because it has spoken so clearly on the matter that there's no other way to interpret it. We know for a fact it has taught the Immaculate Conception. It's not a wax nose. It is objectively identifiable, and you can know this is the claim it is proposing. Now, if we were to somehow demonstrate that the Virgin Mary had children after, I'm thinking of perpetual virginity, the Immaculate Conception. If somehow we were able to identify that Jesus actually taught contrary to the Immaculate Conception or something like that, then that claim would be falsified. The claims of the Catholic Church would be falsified on that point, right? So they are falsifiable, but obviously in this scenario, it's going to be pretty hard to falsify that one. I think it would be easier to maybe try to demonstrate like the papacy claims are false or something like that. Those would probably be a little more attainable. But I think all of these are falsifiable because the Catholic claims that are being made here are objectively identifiable. They're not a wax nose. So I'm gonna have to offer pushback here. I don't think that you could just reinterpret what the magisterium has taught in such a way that it just completely, changes the meaning and just turns it into something completely different to where you can make it just mean whatever. I don't think that that's true. I think that that's unfortunately a caricature of the magisterium. And then that would mean there's no such thing as magisterial reversals, which is false because the Catholic Church recognizes there are some things as magisterial reversals. How can you have magisterial reversals unless you can demonstrate what the Church taught non-definitively and then show that it's been reversed? The only way you could do that is to say that the magisterium has asserted itself in an objectively identifiable way, and now it is reversing that. Well, the Catholic Church already acknowledges that that's possible. So I think that this isn't being fair to the Catholic claims. I'm not saying he's intentionally being unfair or trying to be misleading or something. I'm not judging his intentions. I'm not saying any of that. I'm just saying, like, objectively, I think that this is unfair to the Catholic claims. So let's listen to it once more, because I think there was another aspect to this that I was going to touch on.
Slavery, really, that's heavily qualified. He's not condemning slavery in principle, even though it looks like it may be, because that would be inconsistent with the old teachings. So it seems to me, first of all, that he's employing a hermeneutic that would never... I
think he's talking there of John Paul II, if I recall correctly. But, when it comes to the issue of slavery, the teachings that were made on slavery were always non-definitive. So let's say that a pope completely opposed something a previous pope said on slavery, and both of them teach in their authentic magisterium. So what? That's a magisterial reversal. So what? We already have acknowledged that magisterial reversals are possible in cases of non-definitive teachings, not in case of definitive teachings, but in case of non-definitive. And certainly it's the case that all of the magisterial interventions that have been done that I've seen on slavery have been non-definitive. I haven't seen have y'all come across anything by the magisterium on slavery that's definitive? And then have you ever seen that reversed? I've never seen that. I've never even seen a reversal here of the non-definitive teachings on slavery. So I'm not even conceding that yet, but I'm just saying, I know there are some people who take that position. But even if you do, so what? That's just the magisterial reversal of a non-definitive teaching. And somebody might say, well, if your non-definitive teachings can be reversed, then that's a problem, because you might assent to something today and it turns out that's reversed 100 years from now. Yeah, that's not an issue. It's not an issue. God expects you to be faithful to what is presented to you at the level of knowledge that you have, and that's it. He's not expecting you to have everything figured out, or for the magisterium to settle everything definitively. That's not expected of you. Thomas Aquinas did not believe the Immaculate Conception. I don't think that means he's not a saint. I don't think that somehow harmed his soul, even though the church has now issued a definitive judgment on the Immaculate Conception. Well, he didn't maintain it. So what? It wasn't required of him at the time. It's perfectly possible for a person to have been saved without assenting to that prior to the judgment of the church. And that doesn't mean that the judgment of the church is then useless. Now, there's utility for these definitions, but that gets us into another question. So it's not that the magisterium is a wax nose, and it's also not that, well, you could believe something today and it turns out that that's reversed later on. That's not an issue. Because again, that's not what God expects. That's not the level in the bar of salvation for the individual, is that you have to have a perfect knowledge of everything that is true in this life. And he's not requiring the magisterium to settle every theological dispute in the 21st century. That's not the standard for salvation or for the purpose of the magisterium. It would be pretty cool if somehow the magisterium worked that way, and you could just like lock a pope or an ecumenical council into a room and have them literally offer a solemn judgment on every single proposition possible. That would be kind of cool, but that's not the way the magisterium works. Members of the magisterium actually have to study before they make a judgment. They actually have to prepare themselves and look into the deposit of faith and consult the sense of the faithful. I mean, now technically that's not a requirement, but it's most certainly prudent. Get a feel of the loci, if you will, of tradition, the different locations of tradition, the liturgy, again, the faithful, the consensus of theologians, and the church fathers, all of the different locations of tradition. The magisterium is to consult those things prior to making a judgment. And it's impossible for them to do that on every given possible proposition out there. That can't be humanly done in one lifetime. So obviously it's going to have limitations in its non-definitive judgments. So, I mean, that's not a problem. So anyways, to me, I think that these arguments stem from a misunderstanding of the Catholic magisterium, but you know whose fault that is? It's not Dr. Crummett's fault. It's not Dr. Crummett's fault. You know whose fault it is? Our fault. You know why? Who presents the magisterium this way? Catholics. We're the worst. We are the worst at presenting the magisterium this way. I'm not saying everybody who's Catholic does it. I'm just saying that, don't we in popular apologetic circles kind of portray, especially when we're talking to Protestants, the magisterium in this kind of way? Like, you can't know anything apart from the magisterium. The magisterium, like, literally has to interpret every verse of the Bible for you. Otherwise, you can't know anything that the Bible ever says. How many times do we present our case about the magisterium to Protestants that way? So I'm actually, I'm not faulting Dr. Crummett. That's how we kind of present this. So I think the misunderstandings that we're hearing derives from us. That's why I'm trying to offset some of this stuff with our knowledge of the magisterium in Catholic apologetic circles. Let me grab this one. How do we know for sure what teachings are definitive versus non-definitive? Yeah. So how long do we have, right? Although it's actually not that complex. I'm speaking tongue in cheek here. Well, first go to my magisterium playlist. I go over this in detail a lot. Didn't I do a video on the commentary of the Professio Fidei? Isn't that in the playlist? Let me double check. If it's not in that one, I know it's in some of the other videos I've done, but that would probably be the first one I would go to. I mean, well, first of all, read the document by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Commentary on the concluding paragraphs of the Professio Fidei is what it's called. You're going to want to start there.
Do you want to know the...
You'll also want to read Father Francis Sullivan's book, Creative Fidelity. He's going to give you a lot in there. You'll also want to read, if you really want to deep dive now, on the, beyond the basics, if you want to deep dive, I know I talk about it all the time, the dissertation of Dr. Lawrence Jerome King from CUA on the authoritative weight of non-definitive magisterial teachings. It's a title along those lines. Just type that in on Google. It'll come right up in a PDF available for free. And that's for a deep dive. Let's see. I'm looking at the magisterium playlist. See here. One of the videos I did here, estimating the weight of magisterial teachings with Michael Lofton, that's going to be relevant. Identifying the ordinary and universal magisterium, that's going to be relevant. I sent O2 non-infallible teachings on the magisterium, that's going to be relevant. Here it is, analyzing the commentary on the profession of faith with Michael Lofton. Go to that one. Go through the playlist. There's plenty of stuff in here that goes over it. Now, I mentioned those resources because those are free, right? The playlist, everything in the playlist is free. I mentioned those first because they're available to everybody. However, I do make some content available that is paid for a deeper dive into this. My course on the magisterium is at maximusinstitute.com. It's for $39.99. It's a one-time purchase, and you get all of the videos in downloadable format in MP4. I want to say it's 10 lectures, 9 or 10 lectures. And obviously it supports my family, so I appreciate it if you're able to do that. If not, however, go to those resources in the playlist, because like I said, those are free. It's not all in one place like in the course that I offered, so it's much more convenient in the course, but the same information is like here and there in the playlist, in that Creative Fidelity, and then also Dr. King's dissertation, which is like 400 pages, so it's a lot of work, but that's again for the deep dive. But I'll take a quick stab at this since you're paying a super chat, so I appreciate that. Let me take a quick stab at your question. But obviously this is a very just cursory answer. One of the ways to identify something definitive is to first of all consider, is this a universal organ of the magisterium speaking? Like, is it the Pope speaking as the universal shepherd? Is it an ecumenical council? Those are going to be, universal organs. Now we can also speak of the ordinary and universal magisterium. But that's going to be a little harder to identify. But more commonly, you could just look at an ecumenical council, and is it teaching in a definitive way? And is the Pope teaching in a definitive way? Well, for a Pope, to teach in a definitive way, you have the 3 criteria mentioned by Pastor Eternus in Vatican I. So it's on a matter of faith and morals. He's speaking as the universal shepherd in a way that is that he is defining a matter of faith and morals as the universal shepherd and speaking to the universal church. And so you know, if it meets that criteria, then you have a definitive teaching. Sometimes, you know, in recent years, it's noted that whenever you have that kind of more solemn language, we define that could be an indicator, right? But it's certainly not the only one, and it's certainly not always applicable in some of the early centuries. So it depends on what time period we're referring to. So that's not a 100% always that's the case. If the words we define are used, that's somehow some solemn definition or something like that. But that could be an indicator. Another one could be like if this is a canon at an ecumenical council and it's a canon addressing a matter of faith and morals, and there's an anathema in the canon. Yeah, that's definitive. That's definitive right there. If they're putting forth a profession of faith, those are going to be definitive articles in the profession of faith, because it's a profession of faith. So that's going to be solemn. That's going to be definitive in a solemn way. Those are just a few quick examples. And obviously, if it's going to fall short of something like that, that automatically makes it non-definitive. So by default, once you recognize what makes something definitive, that will then enable you to then identify what's non-definitive, because it's non-definitive is just going to be a lack of the definitive characteristics. So those indicators that make something definitive, they'll just simply be lacking. I know that there's a whole lot more to it than that, but again, go to those resources for a more detailed view. Okay. Let's see. Loved your discussion with Cameron today. Thank you. I appreciate that. Let's see. I think I'm probably just going to take some Q&A. One more point, and then I'm going to take some Q&A. Let's go to the 24-minute mark.
You know, something's got to give. You know, at some point you've got to say, look, we have to do so many things kind of post hoc to make this work out, that the alternative view that the Catholic Church has good things in it, I'm not saying it doesn't, but that some of its doctrines about itself were developed over time for basically political reasons, and it's taught some false things. That explains the evidence in a much more natural, parsimonious way. And at some point, I think you got to be like, yeah, all right.
See, I don't think that that's a strong argument, but I will say that he's somewhat consistent here, because he would actually say the same thing about the Bible, because he does indicate a little bit later on that he does not believe in the inerrancy of Scripture. And so if an atheist were to come back and kind of say the same thing, well, you kind of have to make this work out in the Bible for it to be inerrant. Well, he's going to say, well, I don't accept inerrancy. So there's a little bit of consistency there. However, there's still enough inconsistency here, at least that I'm perceiving, that I think is problematic, because I could just turn this around on him and just say, look, maybe you don't believe in inerrancy, but you at least believe that the New Testament writers, I would think, maybe I'm speaking rashly here, maybe he doesn't believe this, but I would hope that he at least believes that what the New Testament writers assert to be true when using the Old Testament is without error. I would hope he maintains that. If he throws that out, I kind of feel like, well, you could throw anything out at that point in the New Testament. Throw the resurrection out. Throw it all out. So even if he wants to say, well, look, in some select areas and historical areas, I accept errors, but I'm not going to accept errors in propositions of faith and morals or something. Okay, I would hope that that's at least his position. Okay, well, if that is, you can't use... You're going to have it, if you were to have a discussion with a Jewish apologist, you're going to have that same argument thrown in your face, because they're going to say, the New Testament authors are using the Old Testament in such a way that you have to do all kinds of things to make sense out of their use of the Old Testament. Now, I'm a Christian, so I'm going to defend the apostolic use of the Old Testament. So I'm going to defend the apostles. But I am going to say, as I showed in a previous video a few weeks ago, I am going to show, I think in the video it was called like the inconsistency of Protestantism or something like that. You do have to do a lot of work to show that the apostles weren't misusing the Old Testament. I don't believe that they were misusing the Old Testament, but that's not going to be evident on the surface of things. On the surface of things, it's actually going to look like they were misusing the Old Testament, and we're having to do all kinds of mental gymnastics, as they call it, to make it work. Now, I don't think it's mental gymnastics, but a whole lot of people are going to call it that. Matthew's use of Hosea. Matthew's use of Isaiah, the New Testament use of the Psalms in relation to Jesus. There's all kinds of difficulties there that we're going to have to address. And again, somebody can say, but you're having to do all kinds of things post hoc to make it work, just like Dr. Crummett is saying here about Catholics and the magisterium. I just want to say, is there really consistency here? If you have to do a whole bunch of work for the New Testament's use of the Old Testament on matters of faith and morals, then why is that really a problem for us when it comes to the magisterium? And first of all, I don't even concede that we're having to do that kind of work. We do have to do some work. We do have to do some explanations. There are some things that could seemingly seem discontinuous. And there is a degree of discontinuity that could be afforded in according to the Catholic claims. But I understand that even in areas where we would say there could not be discontinuity, we do in some cases have to do some work. I totally understand that. I completely understand that. You have some fathers, for example, who don't seem to affirm the Assumption of Mary or something like that, or who don't seem to affirm this or that dogma. You have to do a little bit of work there. So there's an element of some truth to what he's saying about post hoc here having to do some work to make the magisterium work. There's a grain of truth to that, but we're certainly not doing as much work as we have to do to defend the apostles. I mean, frankly, I'm not trying to be flippant here or sound impious like I don't believe the apostles. I believe the apostles. I'm just saying you got to do a lot of work to make it work so that it's not the case that they're misusing the Old Testament because they're appealing to verses to apply to Jesus. And one verse later, the psalmist is talking about how he's a sinner, but we obviously don't apply that to Jesus. We don't think he's a sinner, but literally the person speaking one verse prior to that, we're applying it to Jesus, but one verse later, where he then calls himself a sinner, we don't apply that to Jesus. So it kind of seems like we're being selective in our use of the New Testament. And we're saying that so-and-so spoke of Jesus and his resurrection. In fact, it wasn't talking in its literal historical context about Jesus and his resurrection. It was talking about David. And so seems like we're misusing the Old Testament. I want us to be attuned to those things because when we use this kind of argumentation, it can be thrown right back in our face. Again, maybe that's not Dr. Crummett's position. Maybe he doesn't believe in the sacred authors and their use of the New Testament. The Old Testament in the New Testament. Maybe he thinks that those things are erroneous. But, well, my rejoinder to that would be you have now greater difficulties than accepting or rejecting the magisterium at this point, because now we're literally rejecting the teachings of faith and morals of the apostles, and these teachings impact the resurrection. For example, they're appealing to the Old Testament to defend the resurrection, and the incarnation and things like that. Now, if we're going to say that those things are erroneous, you have way deeper problems than a rejection of the magisterium. So it's like, I think we need to deal with those issues first before we even talk about the magisterium, because those are much more fundamental than issues of the magisterium. But I would hope that's not his position. But if it's not his position, might there be some inconsistency here? I don't know. Maybe Dr. Crummett will, offer a follow-up video, and we can get a little bit more clarity here. Okay. I'm done. I'll leave the rest alone there. I think I've engaged enough of the presentation to make my point from the previous video on Cameron's show and this one. So let me make sure I'm not missing anything in the chat. Usury is more nuanced than what many rad trads like to define. Yeah, look, whenever somebody uses the usury argument, that's right there. You're spotting a person who probably hasn't studied the issue of usury in any kind of detail. Moreover, they're certainly not familiar with magisterial reversal. So at least that's my impression when I come across somebody who uses the usury argument. Is that somehow a defeater? Is that somehow a refutation of them? No, we still have to address their objections, but I'm just saying that's a red flag. Red flag. If you want to talk reversals, you want to talk about the magisterium reversing something, you don't want to focus on slavery and usury. Those are not the strong arguments. You want to talk about dignitatis humanae. That's where the debate is going to be. You want to talk about that. And that's kind of relevant to his field. So, maybe it'd be good to look into dignitatis humanae. Now, obviously, I don't think that I haven't yet even conceded a non-definitive reversal here. I certainly don't believe that there's a reversal of any definitive teachings on religious liberty. But of course, I've had Dr. Pink on the show who shows otherwise, who shows that there's no reversal in definitive teachings here. And I've also had Michael Dunnigan, who takes a slightly different view, but gets to the same place as Dr. Pink ultimately. I've had him on, so maybe have an engagement with those individuals. If you want to go the dignitatis humanae route, I think that's where the strength would be if one wants to make the claim of a reversal. I think that's where they need to focus, not on the slavery or usury issues. Those are more the like introductory level kind of stuff that you see in popular apologetic circles. Whenever somebody brings up slavery or usury, that's like the popular internet meme level argument that you would use for a reversal or a contradiction, I should say. Haley Luya says 3 shows today. Michael, you must be tired. Michael was also on Logos Project today. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. But I had that shot of espresso this morning, so maybe that's maybe that's what has me going. Thanar says, thank you for your hard work preparing these interactions and active charity to many truth seekers. Thank you, I appreciate it, and I hope I was charitable. I hope I wasn't at any way disrespectful to Dr. Crummett or anyone else. I certainly don't want to be, and I'm not intending to be. My objective is ultimately to engage the arguments, not the person. So I hope that has come across in the presentation earlier with Cameron, and then also in this video here. I didn't bring up a usury because people say it's a reversal, but because it's very interesting theologically with Thomas talking about mutum loans and vex pervitique. I think it was called making very nuanced. Sorry, it's a little hard for me to read here, but yeah. I apologize if I misunderstood why you brought it up. I mean, I just am just pointing out that usually when people bring up the issue of usury, it's because they think that this is one of those, home run issues that just demonstrates that the church has contradicted itself in a definitive teaching. And I want to say, number one, there hasn't been a change in the teaching, and then number two, I don't think that was ever definitive anyway. So that's just kind of where I'm coming from. Make sure I haven't missed anything else. I see Father Brown in the chat. Good to see you, Father Brown. I think I grabbed everything. I did not miss any super chats, did I? I know sometimes I miss them, so please let me know. John says, I pray that Michael becomes a professor at a Catholic university. Tyler says, no, he should be a priest. It would be more likely that I would go for the priesthood than a professor, to be honest with you. More to come on that. Who knows? We'll see. If I were to be a priest, it would be, and that's a huge if. That's a major if. I don't know if I would really want to do that, but if I would go that direction, it would be probably 10, 15 years from now. It would be a long time. My kids would all need to be fully grown, and I would really need to be able to relocate and devote myself to that. So my kids would really need to be grown. So yeah, it would be a long time if I were, to enter the priesthood. Now the diaconate is a different story, so we'll see about that. With the diaconate, I wouldn't have to relocate. And I could just, serve here at the chapel. And so it wouldn't require as much as the priesthood. So who knows? We'll see. Pray that the Lord's will is done. Maybe more on that soon to come. We'll see. Harrison says, does one respect a bishop and give his office honor when they teach something against church teaching? I did a video on that the other day, but I think I did do it for patrons only. But you're a patron, so yeah, go and check out on Patreon. I think I did Thomas Aquinas on wayward prelates or something like that. It was a video on Thomas Aquinas. Go and check that out. Let's see. Jealous of married Eastern Catholics who can join the priesthood, to be honest. I don't know if I'm envious of people who are priests. I don't know about that one. So the level of responsibility that you have for people's souls is it's pretty significant. So I don't know. Hats off to the priests out there. I don't know if I'd ever want to take on that kind of responsibility. Thank you, Harrison, for the super chat. Thanks for the show and everything you do. Keep me wanting to be Catholic. Awesome. I appreciate the support. And once again, thank you for the super chat and also for being a channel member. All right, that's going to do it, y'all. Appreciate y'all watching. Hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. Check me out also, patreon.com/Reason and Theology if you enjoyed this program and you want to support me and my family. See you later. God bless. Oh, wait, before you go, I would really appreciate it if you would consider supporting this channel. This is my primary means to provide for my family, and it also helps me to produce content like this video. If you would like to support me, become a patron by visiting patreon.com/Reason and Theology. You'll also get access to extra exclusive content when you become a patron. Lastly, hit that like button and the subscribe button, and be sure to leave a comment down below. God bless.